and he had scratched all these instructions on the wall of his cell that would lead them to this. Oh, hold on, I've disconnected myself there.
On our podcast, when he disconnects himself, I just take that opportunity to talk.
Welcome to Screens of the Stone Age, the podcast where scientists review movies about prehistoric people. My name is Josh Lindell. I'm a grad student studying Neanderthal teeth, and I'm here with...
I'm Dr. Kimberly Pomp. I am a bioarchaeologist. I study the human skeleton, health and disease, and evolution.
And I'm Dr. Ross Barnett, interested in paleogenetics and Ice Age megafauna.
And today we have two guests on the podcast.
This is where ordinarily Josh would say, you're a teacher in a Shia LaBeouf voice, but I'm an associate professor of archaeology at the University of New Brunswick, and I work on coastal hunter-gatherers in the Northeast.
And my name's Ken Holyoke, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Lethbridge, and I do sort of quarry and sourcing work on the East Coast in the Canadian Maritimes.
And Gabe is hinting at the movie that we're reviewing today, which is Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. This is the fourth one in the now quintilogy. Is that what you call it?
I think we should still call it a trilogy, as far as I'm concerned.
It's like the Douglas Adams trilogy in 5 parts.
So we've done Raiders of the Lost Ark, and this is now the second Indiana Jones movie that we are doing. We're doing them completely out of order, I guess. I don't know. Let's just get into this one and start reviewing it, because we're going to have a lot to say about it, I think. Ken or Gabe, would one of you like to summarize this movie for us?
I can kick us off here. Gabe, do you have you can jump in with any highlights that maybe I missed. So
Excellent. This is going to be like our own podcast. Ken does most of the talking, and I chime in once in a while.
I forgot to say, did you guys say that you host the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast? Did we get that in up front?
Well, we do host it, yeah.
We do host it, yes, yeah. So we've got a podcast basically where we talk about New Brunswick archaeology, but really talk about the Canadian Maritimes and Maine, so an area that we call the Maritime Peninsula, and sort of broader Northeast North American archaeology as well. So we've sort of wrapped, I guess, our first season. Would that be fair?
I guess we're in between seasons, but we're going to be back in the end of August. Yeah,
Gabe's been doing field work, and I have to defend my thesis in a week and a half, so so we've been taking a pause for but
4 weeks,
yeah. So we open on a desert landscape, and it's very, it seems very Indiana Jones, got the nice typeface and everything like that, and it kind of casts out on a bunch of would they be greasers, or what would be the term for the 1950s cool kids in their modified roadster?
Oh, I wasn't sure.
Yeah, greasers, I guess.
Yeah,
rockers. I don't know.
They're racing some army bucks as they drive down the desert highway, and kind of have a fun tete-a-tete, and all the cast, kind of the old style whole credits are coming up on the screen as we roll through there, and then the army vehicles pull off into a side road and head down another desert highway into a restricted area. We quickly learn that these are not American soldiers, that these are Russians posing as Americans to break into this facility. And then as they sort of pull into, after they've killed the guards, they pull into this facility, and out pops Cate Blanchett in a really goofy wig and an even goofier accent. And they pop the trunk, and stuffed into the trunk are the newest member of the team, Mac, who I've got some words about Mac.
If I could just interrupt, I thought it was odd that Cate Blanchett, I thought she was Bob Dylan when she came out after doing that movie she played Dylan in, and it was closer to that than anything she'd played before. But I tried to keep track of how many times Mac said Jonesy, because that was definitely a sore spot for me. But so Jonesy and Mac hop out of the back of the car. They've been captured. I made a note that they were captured digging in the dirt in Mexico, and they start getting grilled by Blanchett, and I can't remember specifically what it was. Oh, I'm gonna let Gabe take off over here, because I think you guys can probably hear the background there. But yeah, so basically they
they're looking for a particular box, and there's all the usual threatening. And so in this way, I guess the movie's really about the curation crisis, right? It's standing in this lab, and there's all these crates, and they threaten Indiana Jones at various points. It turns out his friend, who keeps calling him Jonesy, Mac, is going to double cross him, and they find the box because the mummified remains they're looking for are extremely magnetic. So they follow gunpowder and bullets and things that they throw in the air around to find the boxes. Then there's kind of this sort of classic Indiana Jones chase/fight scene. And then subsequent to that, it ends up, during these battles, it turns out there's going to be a nuclear test. And so there's somehow Indiana Jones ends up being, along with someone he's fighting, kind of launched in this I'm still not really sure what it was, some kind of a fast vehicle on a track that didn't really look like a train. Ends up in a sample village or I guess we should call it town. I'm locked into anthropology mode here a little too much. Sample town that is going to be nuked in Area 51, and it's going to be nuked as a sort of test case. This is the famous fridge scene where Indiana Jones then climbs into a refrigerator and survives being blown up in this nuclear reaction. Then he's interviewed by folks in the FBI, and we find out that he was in OSS. There's a reference to an Air Force fiasco in 1947, and it becomes apparent that Colonel Spalko, who is played by Bob Dylan / Cate Blanchett, is interested in psychic research for paranormal purposes, that she's sort of not in these particular ordinary, I suppose, espionage work. It turns out then that the FBI has also gone and searched Jones's office, and Jones has been assigned a paid leave of absence with it being paid by the Bureau. His dean has negotiated this at great personal expense, and he's been forced to resign. And so I guess that's sort of statement about academic freedom here. Then we find out the Shia LaBeouf character, who's named Mutt Williams, shows up, finds Jones, and says that this fellow Harold Oxley, who Indiana Jones knew from his battle days of archaeology, had found a crystal skull and is going to be killed. Jones says it's a Mesoamerican deity skull. And so then there's another one of these kind of classic Indiana Jones fight scenes where, there's shooting, there's punching, there's running around, all of these kinds of things. And then he and Shia LaBeouf are sort of on the run, and they're going to spend the rest of the... I should add, it invokes an earlier Indiana Jones movie because there's a motorcycle. I guess the motorcycle is a key part of this theme. Shia LaBeouf, and this becomes important later, is a motorcycle mechanic and enthusiast, and he is a chase scene that involves a motorcycle. The motorcycle slides through the library in very dramatic fashion, coming to rest against a statue of Marcus Brody.
And at one point, V. Gordon Child gets a shout out in the library. It's my favorite line of the movie. If you want to be a good archaeologist, you got to get out in the field, or you got to get out of the library.
And so, Ken, actually having done work in this area, this might be time for you to pick up the story, because we're heading south into a region that you've worked.
Yeah. So the pan Meso South American trope of somewhere below Mexico and below seems to all kind of merges together now as we proceed into the Amazon. And they arrive in, I believe it's in Brazil. Is that where they start their journey? Because they need to find the Amazon River. And I'm kind of spacing here on what the sort of first place that they go to is.
They go to Peru, to the Nazca lines, I think, first, don't they?
Oh, yeah, that's right. And they fly over the Nazca lines, which are all smashed together very closely. So every one of the pictographs is highly visible within one screenshot, basically. And so they set out, and I think they do some research, and they figure out that they need to go to that. Is it the cemetery scene? Is the next spot that they go with the guys kind of popping out and jumping very quickly back and forth, because they need to find Francisco de Orellana's grave, basically, where he's buried, to find this object that Oxley says need to get, that's what they did. They went to Oxley's, I guess it was a sanatorium or something like that, where he was being held because he had lost his mind. So they find some instructions in Oxley's cell that leads them to this cemetery with lots of spooky people in it, and then they do, they've got skeletons in the. They come into a crypt basically, and it's Deoriana and his crew, and they find him, Deoriana himself, another magnetic trope, and lo and behold, another crystal skull is revealed. This one with an elongated skull, sort of an elongated cranium, and then from there they head to, what is the next? I'm not very good at this summary here.
There's some sort of deforestation going on to make a road.
Right. Yeah. So they meet up with the Russians again. Yeah, and this sort of, this is the next sort of big chase scene where so they happen upon the camp where they finally find where Oxley is being held. They're captured by the Russians, and out walks Marion as Irina Spalko tries to threaten Jones with killing Mutt, which Jones has absolutely no, he doesn't flinch basically. And then she marches out Marion, who is like, Indiana Jones, where have you been? And then immediately goes over and hugs Mutt. And we get the first indication that Mutt maybe is not just Mutt Williams. And so they kind of meet up with Oxley. Jones gets subjected to the mind meld with the crystal skull, which tells him to return, which is what Oxley was kind of going on about. Not really sure what return is supposed to be, but they think it's that the skull needs to go back to where it was originally found, to take. There's some cosmic power that they're going to get from this, I think, is kind of the thinking that Spalko has. So they escape that. They end up in dry sand, not quicksand. And then they get in the second turncoat or second twist, Mac gives them away again. Oxley kind of led the Russians back to them. So they're captured once again, and they set off through the forest or the Amazon jungle with this giant cutting machine. And, back and forth, this sort of physics-defying bag with a skull in it gets tossed around a bunch of times. There's a nice sword fight between Mutt and Iriana Spalko. There's the probably my least favorite scene of the movie where Mutt goes Tarzan, swings through the jungle, and then they finally emerge, and they run into some giant killer ants, and I can't remember what the name is that Indy gives them, but they escape that. Spalko's right-hand man gets consumed by the ants, and so it's just Indy and his gang, which includes Mac, who's made it clear that he was a double agent, so he's actually a good guy again. And they make their way to the temple, which is actually El Dorado, or what is it? Akatar is what they call it in the movie. And they finally make it there, and after going over a waterfall a couple of times, 3 times, actually 3 waterfalls, and arrive in a temple where they discover that the people in the temple, the Uga, is that the Uga, or is that what the sort of tribe is that they refer to? This fictionalized Mayan, Aztec, Incan, possibly Egyptian group that lots of competing iconography in there. I think at one point there's an Aztec sundial that Indy rolls over to access one of the tombs.
Yeah, it's an aggregation site. It's made very clear.
Actually, none of these temples were built by the Uga, or they were, but they only knew how to do it because they were visited by not aliens, not extraterrestrials, interdimensional beings. And so the crystal skulls are the skulls of these interdimensional beings who sit in a consortium of 13 people, so a small council. And then we enter into the last dizzying half hour of bad CGI, kind of revealing a little bit too much, so leaving nothing to the imagination, to the point that we end the movie with an actual spinning alien spaceship, a UFO disc coming out of a temple, and that knowledge was their treasure. It was not gold. It was knowledge that they were talking about with El Dorado, and so our heroes, without Mac, who turned coat once again, he gets sucked into the interdimensional portal. So we may see him in Indiana Jones 6 or something like that as he gets zapped back out. And then we close on a wedding. Indy and Marion get married, and Mutt tries to grab the hat, and George Lucas and Steven Spielberg rightly anticipated that Shia LaBeouf would probably not be the best bet to replace Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones, and they don't let him wear the hat. And as those of you who've watched Dial of Destiny know, Mutt is a victim of the war in Vietnam. So sometime later, and then cue the music. I'm sure I missed lots in there, but I have lots of notes about specific things that I.
Which I guess it's implicit that despite him discovering that Indiana Jones is his father, that he did not take Indiana Jones' advice and go back to school and get an educational deferment. He just continues repairing motorcycles. Sent over.
Yeah, didn't have bone spurs.
No.
So, going into this movie, I've talked about before on this podcast about how I didn't grow up with Indiana Jones. I never saw any of them until I was an adult, so it had no influence on me becoming an archaeologist. I must have seen all of them before this movie came out, though, in 2008. So I didn't have the build-up of Indiana Jones. This movie didn't have to live up to anything for me, is what I'm saying, right? And for that reason, I feel like I've never really thought this was all that bad a movie. In fact, it's much more in my wheelhouse than the other ones, because we've got the crystal skulls, we've got ancient aliens. That's way more my thing than biblical archaeology and like holy grails and what's the cup called? The Christian immortality Jesus cup.
The Holy Grail.
The Holy
Yeah.
Grail. Did I say Holy Grail twice? The Ark of the Covenant and the Holy Grail. But so yeah, in my mind, this movie is just a much more interesting movie. And then watching it, I'm like, oh yeah, this is a really good movie. And then as we go through, it's like, this isn't so great. And by the time you get to the end, it's like, this doesn't make any sense anymore.
So yeah. I've seen this movie three times now. And once under, as prep for this podcast. And I was already taking archaeology, I think, when I saw it the first time, and I saw it in theaters. And for some reason, I think probably because I had a funny, went out with friends, saw it, I had a kind of generally positive view of the movie the first time, and then watched it the second time and thought, oh, that's really pretty lousy. And that was how I felt about it this third time too. Although I think other people have made the point that the movie, until the last, 40 minutes, really until the last chase scene with Shia LaBeouf fencing on the front of a Jeep, it's not the worst movie I've ever seen, and it invokes the earlier Indiana Jones movies in some interesting ways. And I actually think the tempo and the soundtrack of this are better than the more recent Dial of Destiny movie. So that would be kind of my defense of it.
Yeah. I saw it in theaters, and actually, I distinctly remember I saw this with a friend of mine, and she and I were big Indiana Jones fans, and both of us were immensely disappointed with it when we saw it in theaters. And I'm actually kind of the opposite, where I don't know if I've actually watched it again since I saw it in theaters. And I felt like, having seen Dial of Destiny, this one felt much more in line with the original trilogy, minus the three scenes that I think if they could just totally eliminate them from the movie, it wouldn't change. So, get rid of the fridge scene, get rid of the monkey swinging scene, and don't reveal the spinning spaceship at the end. I feel like you actually would have had a movie very akin to the original trilogy. And Gabe's right, like the pacing is much more like the original trilogy. Like, I don't know if you've seen Dial of Destiny, but the chase scene at the start is cranked up and faster than anything that we've seen in an Indiana Jones movie before. So.
And the dialogue is also, I think, fraught in Dial of Destiny. The dialogue the tempo of it is also strange. I defend the fridge scene, I think. The fridge scene, to me, I don't think is all that much different than, Short Round and Indiana Jones and the other character in Temple of Doom jumping out of an airplane in an inflatable raft.
True. Yeah.
So I have some time for that in terms of the fitting canonically in the whole series.
I read apparently Lucas tried to defend the legitimacy of surviving a nuclear blast in a refrigerator and presented a bunch of research that he had done to Steven Spielberg.
Well, I'm going to sort of chime in and say I kind of agree with Ken. So one of the first films I remember seeing in the cinema as a kid was Holy Grail, which had left a big impression, because that's everyone will agree that's a great Indiana Jones film. And then I also was quite psyched and went to see this Crystal Skull in the cinema in 2008. And it was, I think, the last film I saw in the cinema before my eldest daughter was born. So there was a lot riding on it. And I remember like watching it, and in the first kind of half hour thinking, this is okay, this is good. And then just trying to convince myself towards the end, I'm having a good time, but I really wasn't, because it just kind of falls apart. And I haven't watched it since then. This is only the second time I've watched it, and so there are kind of good parts in it, but it's like the curate's egg. It's good in parts, but overall it's a stinker, I think. And it just, there's so much that's just, you can't even. It kind of defines its own internal logic and doesn't make sense in any kind of real world setting. It's like right from the beginning, which I'm sure we'll go into in a minute. But I just found it really disappointing, and especially now having watched the Dial of Destiny, which as you guys have pointed out, has a very different pacing. But I actually think it works a lot better than Crystal Skull because of that. It kind of leans into Indiana Jones as this kind of aging academic who's really not up to adventuring anymore. And I thought that made it much more interesting, whereas it's only really played for laughs in Crystal Skull, despite him being, in his late 60s when he was doing it. And they just tried to pick it up where he left off and hinted at some kind of adventures, but not in a very interesting way.
Yeah.
I think Shia LaBeouf was the worst part. I think he ruined the movie. I think if they had had a different actor, it would have been better.
Absolutely. He's just not convincing as a bad dude.
Yeah. I think I had a note in I have a note in here somewhere that basically this would be an okay movie even if they just got rid of Mutt and Mac.
Yeah.
I like Mac just I don't know what it was about that character. I think it was that he said Jonesy about like 70 times during the movie. And they were like, is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Is he a good guy?
And nobody cared.
Yeah.
And he does nothing in the movie. I mean, all of his double crossing means jack squat. I mean, there's absolutely no reason for him to be in the film. He does absolutely nothing. Like they capture Indiana Jones, and he's totally irrelevant to the kind of progression of the plot.
Well, I had also forgotten that the alien with the crystal skull that they find in Area 51 is only seen again once in the movie. And it's for Spalko to cut the head open and show Indiana Jones that there's a crystal skull in there. And that alien plays no role in the rest of the movie. And it's not clear how it fits into the table of 13 aliens at the end, because only one of them's missing their skull. So
yeah, it just wasn't one of the council.
I guess so. One of the common aliens.
Well, I think one of the other problems is just that no one is convincingly evil in this movie is part of the problem, right? I mean, is that you sort of in the other movies you usually understand what the motivations are, and it's I guess it's in that way it's sort of a Cold War movie. It's kind of unclear like what the immediate goals are, but once she has this psychic power, what is she trying to accomplish exactly? It's not really clear.
Well, it sounds like actually I put a note here that the strategy is actually very reminiscent of recent Russian policy, in that it's to place our thoughts into the minds of your leaders, so much so that you won't know it's happening. Which I thought was sort of a haunting line.
It also is almost one of those like all your base are belong to us lines. You have to read it twice to kind of figure out what it means.
So we always start off after summarizing the movie with nitpicking scientific and historical inaccuracies. I don't think we're going to be able to do that exhaustively in this movie. The thing about these like big blockbuster movies is that the IMDb pages have a long list of goofs and anachronisms, and like we couldn't even go through all of them. So like we can get out of the way, like the vehicles, the airplanes are all from the wrong years, the maps have the wrong geographies, the wrong borders on them. There are several typefaces used on some of the documents in the movie that weren't invented in 1957. My favorite one on IMDb is regarding those ants that you talked about. It just says, Army ants aren't remotely how they're depicted in the movie. They can't carry people.
Some pissed off entomologist at 3 o'clock in the morning who's just logged in IMDb. Oh, jeez.
On Bugs of the Screen or whatever his podcast is.
So what inaccuracies have we taken in our notes that we feel are worth commenting on in this podcast?
Well, can I vent first? Would that be okay?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I'm kind of on board with these guys, but I wasn't too bothered by the fridge incident, which everyone kind of focuses on, because it clearly says it's lead lined, so obviously it's radiation proof. But you have to remember as well that Indy's drunk from the cup of Christ, so he's sort of quasi-immortal. So the fact that he doesn't end up as essentially soup after being kind of blasted at the speed of sound through the Nevada atmosphere, that's magic. You don't got to explain shit. But yeah, other things that really annoyed me, I took notes on, were, for a start, when they're in the warehouse, which is the same warehouse as is at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they store the Ark of the Covenant, and they're trying to find the intensely magnetic area at Roswell space crash alien, and they use gunpowder, but gunpowder's not magnetic.
Yeah, I made a note of that. I wrote, is lead magnetic?
No, I don't. No, it's not. And also gold's not magnetic either, and that's later on when they're in Oriana's kind of grave, they talk about that. And, it's really stupid. So they know it's intensely magnetic, but they brought along metal crowbars to open it up with. And then, and they've got metal knives and stuff. I mean, it's crazy. Absolutely crazy.
My notes on this are fucking magnets. How do they work?
Yeah. Well, apparently a cloth stops the magnetism.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
But no, it's not magnetism, because they say it attracts gold. So it just attracts metal mysteriously. It's not actually magnetism. But like in the scene in the warehouse, Indy doesn't know that. He thinks it's magnetic, so he asks for gunpowder and lead pellets, neither of which are magnetic, which worked, but it shouldn't have worked because he thought it was magnetic. But also, like, there's major, like, inconsistencies in how this magnetism works, because sometimes they're attracted to metal, but sometimes they're surrounded in guns and vehicles, and don't seem to be affected. And just the whole concept that these aliens have magnetic skeletons, and somehow they've amassed a collection of metal artifacts from around the world. How did they do that without just having this stuff stuck to them as they're moving around constantly?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that might be how they do it. He's very clear that they're collectors, so they're archaeologists, I think is the line.
Yeah, exactly.
They didn't intentionally collect this room full of artifacts. They just, everywhere they go, they come back covered in metal.
Yeah, I certainly walked into a collector from let's say the coast of Maine and gone into their office and thought, well, they must be magnetic for chert. It's like
It could be too. Disney owns all these different properties now, and this is how they plant the seeds of Magneto appearing in the Marvel movies. Is that he was actually one of these interdimensional beings that appeared in the Indiana Jones movies, and you can get a crossover in the future.
Well, if anybody's listening now, they're going to do that. Yeah.
That was annoying. But there's more things that have annoyed me in this as well, which I can go on with. I think Ken already mentioned that they've sort of smooshed all the Nazca lines together, all these incredible kind of Peruvian geoglyphs of the hummingbird and the condor and the monkey and all these kind of amazing things, which are spread out over hundreds of miles, but they all have to be in one sort of screenshot. And they're not really relevant to the plot particularly. They're just a kind of marking spot. I don't know. It kind of fed into Eric von Daniken style Ancient Aliens guff about how they can only be seen from the air, blah blah blah. One thing else that really annoyed me, I'm just kind of rattling through these because there's so many, but there's a bit when they're in the jungle and Shia LaBeouf gets a scorpion on him, and Indiana says that it's going to bite him, You don't have to be a PhD biologist to know that scorpions don't bite; they sting in their tail. I mean, it really pisses me off when someone who's supposed to be educated, like Indiana Jones, says something stupid like that. And the same thing happens in Temple of Doom, which I watched again recently, where they've got giant fruit bats flying over the jungle, and he calls them giant vampire bats. And then that's just like, I can't do it. I can't listen to that. I can't respect somebody that would mistake fruit bats for vampire bats.
Russ, you got to be careful because we've got 59 episodes of us talking like unscripted, and we're going to have stuff in there that someone's going to nitpick where we say the wrong word. For example, I'm editing something for YouTube, which I don't know if it'll be up by the time this episode comes out, but we recently looked at the video game Skyrim. And in the course of editing it, both you and I keep calling the deer antlers horns. And I know someone's going to be in the comments saying, deer don't have horns, they have antlers.
Well, they can fight us. That's fine.
Can I just chime in on the scorpion for a minute? I have this problem when I watch this movie. So I did my my graduate work in Connecticut, a lot of it, and where Lyme disease is a big thing, right? So that's the big killer monster there. But also for reasons that I'm sure he's always appreciated, my supervisor actually looks a little bit like Harrison Ford and dresses a little bit like him. Ken knows what I'm talking about here. And also maybe engages in some of the lifestyle as well. And his advice about ticks was always that the ones you could see aren't the ones with Lyme disease. And so once I'd gotten into that headspace, I had a hard time getting out of it as the movie progressed. This was my old professor.
Yeah. I made a couple notes about the Mitchell Hedges skull, which is actually a real thing. And a funny thing that I found, though, is apparently Belize sued Lucasfilm over the misuse of, it was that they hadn't requested. So Belize was trying to essentially get money for a proven fake crystal skull because it was being used by Lucasfilm, its image, and it must, the Hedges family must have something to do with the Belizean government. I didn't quite. I saw the byline about it. I guess I didn't investigate it a whole lot, but the Mitchell Hedges skull is a real thing that was found. It's a real forgery, like a lot of these crystal skulls were. But when there's a few things that they sort of dust throughout. Like Akator is a real place, but it's not. Or it's rumored to have been, but it's conflated with El Dorado. Akator, I think, was something else. It was purported to be an underground city somewhere in the Amazon jungle that's never been found, but it's not what they call El Dorado, basically.
Does anybody else know more about the background behind these crystal skulls? Because I do know a fair bit about the crystal skulls. It's very interesting stuff. Especially the Mitchell Hedges skull is the interesting one.
It's in the British Museum, isn't it? I think the Mitchell Hedges skull.
The Pseudo Archaeology Podcast does one too, I think.
The British Museum skull is just called the British Museum skull. It's different from the Mitchell Hedges skull, but they reference both of these when Indiana Jones first meets Mutt, and he tells him about the skull. He mentions the Mitchell Hedges skull, and Indiana Jones says, "I saw one like it in the British Museum." So he's referring to the British Museum skull there. There are a handful of others. There's one, there's a Paris skull in, I can't remember which Paris museum, and there's another one. I think there's 3 that are available in museums. The Mitchell Hedges skull is privately held, and it was found allegedly by Anna Mitchell Hedges, who's the daughter of F.A. Mitchell Hedges, who was a quote-unquote archaeologist at the time, which was more of an adventurer and an author, and it was found in Belize, which at the time was quote-unquote found in Belize, which at the time was British Honduras. And so allegedly, his daughter, Anna Mitchell Hedges, found it in 1924, except there's no record of it being found at the site in 1924 by F.A. Mitchell Hedges or by anybody else who worked at the site or any of the documentation from this archaeological site. And as we know, archaeologists take a lot of documentation, so if it was found there, it should be recorded. There's also no evidence from anybody who worked at that site that Anna Mitchell Hedges was actually at the site in 1924 when it was allegedly found. And so after F.A. Mitchell Hedges died in 1959, I think, his daughter, Anna, kept the skull, and she kept it until her death in the early 2000s, and now her husband still owns the skull. So it's privately held. It's not available for scientific study. Unless he's died recently, I'm not sure. He must be getting pretty old. But Anna Mitchell Hedges maintained that it had paranormal abilities throughout her entire life, and occasionally she would take it on tour and charge admission. And she claimed the lore behind it was that it was a Mayan skull and that some Mayan priest used it for rituals. And it's sometimes called the Skull of Doom because it was like supposed to like mark people for death and then they died. Anna Mitchell Hedges even claimed that she actually killed somebody with it somehow. I don't know how you make a claim that you murdered somebody and think you can just get away with that. But so the interesting thing about this skull is that there's a paper trail for this skull. There's no record of it being found in 1924, which is when they claim to have discovered it. There's no record of Anna or F.A. Mitchell Hedges talking about it before 1943. But there is a record of it going back to 1933 when it was known as the Burney skull, I think, if I wrote that correctly. Because it was in the possession of a Sidney Burney, who tried to sell it to some museums and eventually sold it through Sotheby's auction to F.A. Mitchell Hedges in 1943. So he clearly didn't dig up this skull in 1924. There's receipts. He bought it in 1943.
You've literally got the receipts.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a receipt, but there's... I have a webpage open. There is literally like a posting from Sotheby's auction with like a picture of the skull for sale. So we can't study this one scientifically because it's still privately held. And her husband, who owns the skull still claims it has paranormal abilities, even though we know it was bought from an auction house. But all the other skulls, the British skull and the Paris skull, have been subjected to scientific analysis. And we can tell from them that they were made, from like scanning electron microscopy, we can tell they were made with modern late 1800s rotary tools using modern abrasives like diamond dust or other things like this. And we can tell the provenance or provenience, I can't remember which one it would be in this case, of the quartz. Of all these skulls, it comes from a Brazilian source because of the chemical makeup. That's the only place it could have come from. And we also can tell that this type of quartz was being used a lot in a very specific town in Germany where they were very crafted, very, very skilled at quartz craftsmanship, quartz carving, or whatever you'd say, quartz working. And so it's very likely that all these skulls were sourced from Brazilian quartz and were made in one specific town in Germany between the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and then sort of dispersed through art collections where eventually I think the British skull was the first one to gain notoriety as allegedly being a Mesoamerican or Mayan or Aztec artifact. And then once you have that one, everybody else has a copycat, and they're like, oh, I also have a mysterious Aztec artifact. But they're all late 1800s, not forgeries initially, because we don't know why they were initially carved, but maybe some of the later ones were. So that's the crystal skulls. They're real, but they're not archaeological.
If I may, though, I mean, if these are interdimensional beings, they may be smart enough to self-forgery their skulls to, create this story so that you can't actually know their true secrets.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, that sounds likely.
Well, the Mitchell Hedges skull has a separate jaw and cranium, but all the rest of them are just one piece. So if they were real interdimensional beings, then they would have had immovable jaws.
Still some concerns about sourcing across the universe, too.
Maybe on one of their trips, their buddy died and they needed some extra cash to get back home, so he sold their skull to Sotheby's.
There you go. Do any of them have the elongated skull like in the movie?
No.
Yeah, okay.
I just Googled. No.
Yeah.
They're conflating two things. So the elongated skull, that's a form of artificial cranial deformation, which is real and very common. Like it's found in every continent on Earth. So people have been doing that for a long time. Does anybody know much about head binding or cranial elongation?
So the Nazca do that with that shape of cranium too, and they have a head cult, like a religion. The head represents fertility, I think, and oh, now I don't remember. Something from undergrad. But yeah, they did do that with the deformation of the cranium. Intentional modification.
Do we see that in ancient Egypt as well? I know like King Tut had a weirdly shaped head, but was that just like genetic from
I think that's just from all the
inbreeding?
incest.
I was going to
probably.
say, I think that's inbreeding. Yeah, it's like the Habsburg chin.
But you can have cranial modifications. You can have intentional modification like the Nazca, where there's something symbolic about it and they want their cranium to be that shape. And then you can have unintentional but still acquired modification just by accident. And so I think in Egypt, that's what happened often is infants were like swaddled down and they had a binding around their head to hold them down in place. And then that actually caused cranial modification.
Yeah,
So
people
if a
forget
baby
how
is laying
easy it is
down
to
on their-
modify the skull. Like
Yeah, they're
even
very
kids today, if you leave
plastic
them
at that
lying
point.
on their back for too long, then their skull kind of gets flattened at the back.
Gets flat.
Yeah, my son had a very expensive, very special pillow that he had to sleep on because he had a very flat back of his head.
Yeah.
So I believe, if I remember correctly, in Egypt, so it would be that. And so they had the flat back of the head because the head was on it. And then they also had a strap around the forehead holding that child down. And it was thought to be good practice because it kept the child safely in bed, right? But then you'd have this flat on the front, flat on the back cranial shape. So there's some that are symbolic and ritualistic, and then there's some that are just bad parenting.
That's called cradle boarding, right?
Cradle born, yeah.
So one of the things I've heard you guys kind of make comment on in a number of the movies is the Bechdel movie test about the women in movies, and so while I was watching this, I was trying to keep track of when Cate Blanchett and Marion, I heard, her name's slipping me right now, when they were sharing a screen together, when Irina and Cate Blanchett and Marion were in the same scene. There was only a couple scenes where they're actually together, but there are a couple scenes where they're in the same scene, and there's a website that I guess like tracks the Bechdel test in all these different movies, and somebody makes an argument it actually passed the second test, which is that they talk to each other, because in the scene where Irina is on the hood of the Jeep and spins the machine gun towards Marion, she yells "ah" at her, and and so they're also not talking about a man in that scene, and they're communicating. So there's one person that argues that they actually passed the test because they communicated to one another.
Oh, geez.
But I think they are basically the only two women in the movie.
Yeah.
We don't
think
know the
so.
gender of the interdimensional beings.
That's true.
Or even if they have gender.
Yeah.
Exactly. Although they do look very anthropoid in terms of their crystal skeleton, which is always really annoying as a biologist to sort of see that they essentially have a classic mammalian skeleton with just a few kind of tweaks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it means you won't be out of work when our alien overlords come for us. You'll be useful to them.
Have we talked about this before? Why this is why like the stereotypical gray aliens are impossible? Like if aliens come to Earth, they're not going to have a humanoid body shape just because of the way evolution works. Like that tetrapod mammal or tetrapod animal skeleton with 4 limbs and a head at one end has literally only evolved once on the entire history of Earth, and like the vast majority of living things are nothing like that shape.
Yeah.
So the idea that the intelligent species that develop space travel on another planet is going to be shaped exactly like humans is absolutely impossible. Like
It's just massive hubris on our part that
yeah,
they're going to look like us. But yeah, I mean, even just looking at life on Earth, bilateral symmetry is not all that common. You've got your starfish and your echinoderms, all these things which have radial symmetry. And there's some really nice sci-fi books. Harry Turtledove does some great ones where his aliens, who are Martians set in an alternative universe, but they have, I think it's 7-fold radial symmetry as well. So they don't look anything like humans, and that makes them slightly more believable. And you've seen that in other kind of recent films like Arrival, where the aliens are kind of quite unearthly, although they do look like big squids, so who knows.
I mean, the problem with that in this movie is that there'd have to be another 30 minutes of exposition while Indiana Jones tried to explain that to Shia LaBeouf, which would be pretty intolerable.
Who knows? They may have had those scenes in there and they just decided to get rid of it. That's too much beef. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned how they're not aliens, they're interdimensional beings, and I think that this is one of the silliest things I've ever heard of in filmmaking, because Steven Spielberg didn't want to do another Alien movie because he felt he'd already done too many. He did E.T. and he did
Close
Encounters. And he didn't want to be associated with more Alien movies. And when apparently this script goes way back to like 1992 is when they started working on this. So they were like working this over for a long time. And somehow George Lucas telling Steven Spielberg, they're not aliens, they're interdimensional beings, even though you have Area 51 and you have Roswell, New Mexico, and they look like gray aliens and they have a flying saucer at the end. And they have like all of these things. They're clearly gray aliens, but he just says, oh no, they're not aliens. They're interdimensional beings. And Steven Spielberg's like, yeah, okay, this is not an alien movie. This is a interdimensional being movie. I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
But it's really annoying because there's absolutely no explanation of how they know that. Like, it just... The characters say that, and then everyone's like, "Oh, okay, that's what they are." I mean,
the skull told them.
Yeah, Ox knows everything because the skull is psychic. That's why he went crazy, because he knew too much knowledge. He read the Elder Scroll to give you a reference that you don't get, and I don't know if Ken or Gabe get.
Yeah,
I think we're too old for it. And as I think probably one of the best lines in the film, which is one that has stuck with me since I saw it in 2008, where Jim Broadbent, who plays the Dean, says to Indy, "We're at an age where life stops giving us things and starts taking them away." And that's I didn't remember that it was from this film, but it's one that stayed with me since then. Clearly, as probably the oldest amongst us, that resonates with me.
And Indy becomes the Dean at the end.
Well, like he becomes, I believe, what's called on Twitter an Ass Dean. He's the associate Dean.
Well, he's certainly an ass.
Dean-let. Yeah. Which does not appear to last. I mean, since we find out that he's at, Hunter College, which makes you wonder if he got promoted up and over,
So because in Dial of Destiny, there's some interdimensional travel as well, right? And so, not to jump movies here, but there's a throughput between these two that one involves interdimensional beings and the other one is jumping back in time. And I don't know if that was intentional. Probably not at all. Actually, I don't know how much Lucas and Spielberg were even involved in Dial of Destiny, but
no, Spielberg doesn't. It's the first one he's not directed, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going back to what you were saying, Ross. I thought one of the interesting things about the series, actually, because I was also struck by that they're drinking wine at Indiana Jones's house or apartment or whatever. It is interesting that there's, I think in each of the movies, there's a scene that's sort of like that, right? Like a thoughtful scene at Indiana Jones's apartment. Maybe it's just been ransacked. Maybe he's angry about the Beatles. Maybe he's gonna go find his father. Maybe, but I do think that in that, I think that's one of the good things about this movie is that it's more canonical in some ways than it could have been.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's probably a deliberate act on their part because it's what nearly 20 years, like 19 years since the previous one, so they've got to kind of ramp up the callbacks just to kind of keep the faithful coming along to it. Yeah. And as one of those faithful, I went along to it and it's like, oh yeah, I recognize that bit. That's like that other bit from there's the Ark of the Covenant. But yeah, I think it kind of relied on that maybe a bit too much without adding too much that was sensible or coherent.
Yeah, they just kept focusing on him grabbing his hat in the last minute, or like they redid that kind of over and over in this movie, right?
Yeah, and they have all the kind of classics like a booby-trapped underground complex kind of stuff, calling back to all of them essentially have that. But here it doesn't make any sense because the whole thing is that the interdimensional beings want the skull to be returned, That's what they're saying. They want it to be returned. The people that they were interacting with knew that it had to be returned. Why the hell have they kind of made it so difficult to return it?
But also, how did the skull get out of the room? That was the part. You needed the skull to open the room. So how did they get into the room to get the skull in the first place? And like, how did Dioriana, who I'm guessing was the person who removed the skull, number one, how did he get it off of the rest of the body? Because presumably they were alive in their hive mind thing when he arrived. And then how did he get into that room that requires you place a skull upside down to open the door?
Maybe it's just a magnetic lock, and he could just use a big magnet.
I was just reading something, because there's a few mummies in this movie, which maybe we can touch on. But I was reading a little bit about Peruvian mummies, and I should have read it more closely now that I'm talking about it. But one of the things I read was about how these early Spanish conquistadors, when they were discovering these mummies in Peru, they had a very strange reverence for them, because of course they looted them and they stole all the valuables on them. But at the same time, they were sort of afraid of them because it was clearly some sort of important, powerful thing. And so out of respect for the mummies that they were looting, they took off their shoes when they walked into the room or the cave or wherever these mummies were to steal all their stuff. So I wouldn't put it past these conquistadors to, close the door behind them after stealing the skull.
There's also kind of probably the darkest movie or moment in the movie, and probably maybe the darkest moment in all of the movies, is the sort of casual mass slaughter of the indigenous group guarding the temple at the end.
Yeah.
I mean, like, which is maybe sort of like drawing attention to sort of this sort of repeated colonialism subjected to this group that's protecting this temple. But it's like they pan across the Russians just sort of like mass slaughtering this group of indigenous caricatures that had emerged from the temple, basically, right? Like that it was a really odd throwaway and seemed really kind of out of step with like any other previous, there's always sort of a little bit of collateral damage, I think, in these movies to the locals, but most of the time the deaths are evil Nazis or something like that.
Yeah, it was really jarring.
Yeah.
It was like a real kind of emotional tone shift when they cut to that scene.
I just thought that there would be more commentary on it after, like it would be, they'd make a point with it, but they didn't seem to.
Yeah.
I think that's also part of the problem, is that in the other movies, there's at least immediacy of the evil that is supposedly being fought, right? Whether or not it's effective or not, you can sort of, without too aggressively invoking, just war theory or whatever, that Indiana Jones is, that it's an immediate threat from the Nazis that Jones is addressing, right?
Yeah.
So whether he's successful or not, people get injured clearly when he's doing this in, I can't remember, various Mideast villages and cities and such, but you sort of understand why he's doing it. It's a little less clear. He's sort of fighting this vague psychological threat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the biggest crime of this movie is the way it treats indigenous people and basically all of the Americas from Mexico to, South America. Like you already said, it conflates basically everything south of the United States as Mexico.
Yeah.
They're in Peru, and culturally and like the music playing there, this feels more like Mexico, right? Like they're not very similar countries apart from the language. And you have two encounters with indigenous people trying to protect a site, and it seems like the movie wants you to think the right thing to do is to kill them to get into the site.
Yep.
The first case is when they're at Cusco at the Nazca lines, when they're grave robbing. Mutt reads a sign that says grave robbers will be shot, and Indiana Jones says, good thing we're not grave robbers, and throws them a shovel. But they were intact. They were, if I'm not mistaken, I might be misremembering, but they were attacked by indigenous people there as well, who crawl around like creepy spiders because they're not humans, they're NPCs in this video game. They're non-player characters. And instead of being like, oh, we shouldn't be grave robbing, the correct thing to do is to shoot a blow dart backwards through the tube into the guy's mouth and kill him, which it has been pointed out 1,000 times. That would not, the pointy part wouldn't hit him, so why would it kill him? Doesn't make any sense. But
give him a tickly throat.
Yeah. But they just kill the indigenous people there who are trying to stop them from grave robbing, and that's a good thing. And then again, we have the larger group of indigenous people at the Amazonian temple, who they don't personally kill, but they still get killed. And they're again, not characters, they're NPCs. They're just an obstacle for the heroes to get through, right?
Mm.
And we can see this in the languages as well. So the letter that the cryptic letter they get from Ox is written in an extinct language, which he describes as being called Koyoma, which is a real language. It has a Wikipedia page that has one sentence explaining that it belongs to the Witoten language family, and then a following paragraph talking about its use in the Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. So I can't tell you anything about it, but it's a real extinct language from Peru and Colombia, which is great, except that he says in order to figure out how to read it, he has to walk it through Mayan, which is a language family from Mexico and Central America, which is thousands of kilometers from Peru, and there's no connection, as far as I know, between the Mayan language families and the Witoten language families. So it doesn't make any sense to me why he thinks he can use his knowledge of Mayan to translate the Koyoma language. He also is speaking Quechua in Peru, in the city, which again is a real indigenous language from Peru. But he says he learned that because he ran with Pancho Villa, and some of his men spoke Quechua, which again, Pancho Villa is from the Mexican Revolution. So it's unclear why indigenous Peruvians were running with Pancho Villa speaking Quechua for him to have learned it then.
I do want to interrupt just for a second. The Pancho Villa thing really made me think that Ken's been complaining a lot about finishing his dissertation. He keeps telling me he's got family commitments or something like this, but he wasn't running with Pancho Villa, with the drafts in his saddlebags. So
I felt like one of the things that was missing from the end of the movie, like I'm kind of jumping back here to what Ross was talking about, sort of some of the callbacks to the previous movies. I felt like the end scene of the wedding, I kept waiting for something to sort of motivate the action once again, and that somebody would show up at the wedding with like some object, and that the movie should have ended with Marion sort of like Indy, sort of kind of call back to like something that would have been a little bit more like, it just seemed too soft. I don't know why. It kind of lacked like Last Crusade ends with that they literally ride off into the sunset, right? And Temple of Doom, it's kind of a Bond, like sort of James Bondian end where he kind of gets the girl, and but I just felt like this one kind of, I don't know, it was way too delicate in the way it ended.
Well, it really should have been like The Graduate, I think, where Dustin Hoffman appears and is shaking the panel in the back, and then runs off, and it turns out that Dustin Hoffman is a competing archaeologist who's always had a real soft spot for Marion, and has actually been sitting in on some classes at Berkeley, but just came down to Peru,
That would have been great.
Yeah.
That would have been.
I think, though, in my opinion, that we actually kind of touched on. So I spent too much time trying to think about why this movie is and is more annoying, despite the supernatural elements, than the other ones, right? And so I think when you guys did, was it Last Crusade that you reviewed, or Raiders? I can't remember.
We did Raiders.
Raiders, yeah. You talked about the kind of supernatural elements of that movie, right? And I don't find them maybe as annoying as I think particularly you did, Josh. But I think one of the things about all the first three movies is that they at least make some internal coherence, right? And so the closest I could actually come to was this idea that what the first three movies are really about is that they're about the ontological turn in anthropology. And so if you've got this kind of idea, right, and this, I don't know if this is going to make any sense or not. This is what I dreamt up this morning in the shower, was that the sort of famous like debate about whether ontology is just another word for culture hinged on, everyone was talking about the newer twins, right? That if we think about, Pritchard's famously said, the newer think that twins are birds, right? But a lot of the ontological turn folks said, well, the mistake we're making is we're saying that the newer think twins are birds, and obviously what's interesting about that is that they're wrong, that there's this objective reality which is incorrect. But maybe it would be more interesting if the way we try to approach the newer is to think about, well, how can we imagine a cultural system in which it makes sense? And in fact, the newer twins actually are birds, right? And so in a certain way, I think, if you, the Kalima thing is a little far-fetched, right? But if you imagine what that movie is actually bringing Indiana Jones to try to discover a cultural system in which the whole Kalima thing works. I think those movies make some sense on that merit. I think even actually Dial of Destiny makes a little bit of sense on that merit. I think this one doesn't, because the whole premise is that, well, they weren't sophisticated enough to have irrigation, so they had to be aliens, right? So rather than having that really anthropological experience that Indiana Jones is going through, despite all the problems, to discover why the Kalima works, or that the Grail, in fact, can give you eternal life, or whatever, there's none of that in this movie. There's none of that realignment of the cultural system. So that's my operating theory on the problem here.
That's an interesting take. I really like that. But so I was hoping, because I know you guys are archaeologists, we're more paleoanthropology, paleontology focused here. So I'm trying to go back to my undergrad archaeology theory. There was a couple of lines which you already touched on, Ken, that I feel like we could talk about for a long time. So when they're sliding on the motorcycle through the library, before he says, if you want to be a good archaeologist, you got to get out of the library, the student asks him, he says he has a question about Hargrove's normative culture model, and he says to forget Hargrove, read Vere Gordon Child on diffusionism. And this made me realize that we're actually at a pretty interesting point in archaeology in 1957, right, in this movie, because this is where we have the shift from the culture historical period of archaeology to the processual period of archaeology, which I don't know how much our listeners know about archaeology. Probably most of our listeners don't know much about archaeology theory. So we have, like, over time, the school, like the field of archaeology, has had paradigm shifts where our perspective has changed. And I wonder if either of you wanted to sort of expand on the normative culture model or Vere Gordon Child on diffusionism. We've talked about diffusionism on this podcast for sure, because that always comes up when we're talking about ancient aliens. But maybe my first question here is, Vere Gordon Child's a real guy. Do you know who Hargroves is? I couldn't find out for sure if Hargroves was a real person.
Didn't ring a bell for me. I actually made a note to look that up, and I didn't do that. But it's funny. So we talked about this in our Dial of Destiny review, because I seem to remember we got into talking about how, like, you're kind of in the heartbeat of, sort of in the, we were talking about when Binford's Archaeology is Anthropology would have come out at that time by Dial of Destiny, and so you're kind of sitting on the cusp of this onset of the shift in what is it, 1952 that we're in?
The movie is in 1957.
1957. So you're kind of like
Willie and Phillips will be, or I can't remember, either Phillips or Willie, and then later Willie and Phillips will be like the year after this movie.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So like 1958. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, like, Child is fairly respected, I think, even now, right? And like, diffusionism is problematic, but I think that where we work from now kind of harkens back a little bit more to both Gabe and I are kind of I wouldn't call us culture historians, but there are parts of culture history that I think are sort of critical to the discipline that had been lost during, kind of a hyper focus on generalization about, cultural laws and systems, basically, that we do like humans, we do study humans and think that, it might be okay to associate them with the things that they've made.
Can you define for our listeners what the culture historical period of archaeology actually means? Because I think your audience might be geared a little more academic than ours is.
Sure. Yeah. So, basically, there's the culture history is a theoretical paradigm that's focused on putting periods in order and trying to find culture change. And in its classic form, it imagines culture change as primarily being strongly related to diffusion, so populations moving around. And in the sense that it's normative, but the result of thinking about culture that way is that you kind of have to average out cultural traits. And so you might think about kind of these generalizations, right? And you can imagine that culture change is imagined not so much as a kind of materialist continuum, but instead as a series of kind of abrupt changes, right? And if you think about those abrupt changes, you end up with an illusion of the past that's focused on like replacements and those kinds of things. One of the key things, and that's the real classic formulation, it's not, I don't think, how people think about doing culture history now, but one of the things that was critical to that paradigm was that it's not until 1949 that radiocarbon dating is invented. And then it's, another decade before it's widely available. And then it's become much more refined in recent times. So dealing with just making sense of time was very hard. So like the listener, might think about the kind of stuff archaeologists do, right? Where they put types of ceramics in order, right? Or types of arrowheads in order. And so that's a very culture historical thing to do, right? And to try to figure out those horizons over different places. And a lot of the terms that archaeologists still use to describe culture change derive from the culture historical paradigm, right? So we might, archaeologists will talk about periods or about cultures, right? Archaeological cultures, phases, horizons, traditions, all of these terms that we still use to talk about archaeology arise out of that. And then in the 1960s, which is a time of, I guess, revolutionary thought in many disciplines, the so-called new archaeology or processual archaeology comes on the scene and proposes a more scientific approach, I guess, that emphasizes the scientific method, deductive reasoning, and trying to figure out universal laws about humans. So do you like what I've done here? I've given the straw man argument for each paradigm to make both seem as bad as possible. But in the kind of nutshell, that's what those approaches are. So think about kind of what historians do on the one hand, and then what scientists do on the other. And and I think in many ways the last, maybe the last 30 years of archaeological theory have been seriously trying to reckon with the collision of that, along with the collision of those conflicts with the postmodern approaches that would also occur in archaeology. But a question I would have about all this, though, especially vis-a-vis Indiana Jones, is it's not actually clear to me to what degree Jones is like an Americanist anthropologist, like an anthropological archaeologist. And I don't know that much about, biblical archaeology. This is really the only one in which he's an American.
Yeah, he's really a classicist.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not really like this is what we were talking about when we were talking about the Dial of Destiny thing, is it's not really clear to us how much these sort of theoretical shifts in Americanist archaeology would have influenced the way that Jones approached archaeology. And this is the only one that takes place in the Americas, and the only one that would have been kind of influenced by that sort of anthropological background. And he talks about Child too, right? Which is, Child didn't had an impact on Americanist archaeology, but not in the same way that he did on British archaeology and classical archaeology. So yeah, I don't know. I can't remember where we settled on this when we talked about the Dial of Destiny one.
Yeah, I don't think we did settle on this. I think we were confused. I mean, it's also not clear, right? I mean, Jones, by the time Dial of Destiny comes out, is one gets the sense he's portrayed as being very out of touch and very out of style in the discipline. Whereas in, it's unclear if he gets promoted to Asteen for the reason so many people do, which is that they're kind of troubled. They're not great people to be in departments with, so you need to move them up and out. Or if this is, a genuine promotion is it Marshall College?
Which is consistent. So
it's still, yeah.
So
and it's based at Yale. It's filmed at Yale, I guess.
Yeah. So is this one though, because he's not affiliated with the museum anymore in this movie. So who is funding his research in this one or this expedition?
So I hadn't thought about that, Ken, until you sent that paper last night by
Kevin McHugh. Yeah.
McHugh.
So a colleague of mine at University of Lethbridge here wrote a paper sort of about in popular cinema and one of the subsections of it is talking about who funds the archaeology in these, and it's and the point that he makes, because this would have been, he wrote it before this movie came out, but but that the museum, sort of one of the things that Indiana Jones gets right is that it kind of indicates into a popular audience the way that, some of this research is funded, right? That, that like this isn't all driven by some, wealthy philanthropist or some crackpot trying to you need to secure funding for this, and the tit for tat for Indiana Jones is that he brings artifacts back to the museum. But in this one, he sort of just takes off on his own.
Well, he's being paid by the FBI, and he's got to leave, so it at least explains course reductions, which my understanding is that's the only way to get a course reduction is actually to have the feds kick down your door. But yeah, Indiana Jones and the National Science Foundation just doesn't have the same pizzazz,
Yeah.
I suppose.
But the NSF came in, the 65?
I'm not sure, but that seems about right.
Yeah.
And sure could be even later than that, right?
Shirk, I think, was 71.
Yeah. Wintergren. But yeah, Wintergren's probably been around for a long time.
Yeah, maybe it was Wintergren.
Yeah.
Might have been Wintergren.
Well, Wintergren is also very clear. They're the only granting agency that makes clear you can, pay bribes with it.
Secured safe passage. I think that's the.
Is that the phrase they use now?
don't
Yeah,
know.
they were very clear when I went to the presentation that it was okay. You just need to talk to them about how to phrase it. I thought another interesting theme. There is a certain theme just here about, and you touched on this, Ross. I think about aging, right? Like what is the kind of and I think that is another place where this movie, or one place where this movie I think is more interesting about it than I guess maybe we saw it because I thought Dial of Destiny does not handle that aging particularly well in the sense that it does it by really trying to make Indiana Jones kind of superhuman, right? Whereas I think you could imagine that approach here as being a very fit 60-year-old, but they never really talk about what I would think of sort of the good parts about late career academia are, right? Indiana Jones is at no point mentions, it's great, I've accomplished these things are interesting. And, maybe that's silly, but it would be nice to occasionally see something beyond that, just what life takes away. Maybe I'm just hoping that things are going to get better, rather than get worse.
He does make a point of saying he's a tenured professor of archaeology, though.
He does.
Part-time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, he also has an alcohol problem, and his wife left him, and so I think he has problems outside. Like, he might have been a problematic, and he was all throughout a problematic person already, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Like, I love him, I'd marry him, but he's not the best man.
Yeah, that's true.
Oh, yeah. I had the part-time actually made a note. I said, can we assume he's on a 50-50 contract and that it's all teaching and research? There's no service component of his of his employment.
Can you imagine having to go to a departmental health and safety meeting and the chair is Indiana Jones?
Well, maybe speaking to his problematic nature, he's not allowed to be the undergraduate advisor anymore.
And so you
Or
guys,
postgrad.
you guys kind of opened my eyes to the really problematic the relationship age difference between Indiana Jones and Marion that's pointed out, that you guys kind of did the math on it. And one of the things I thought was that keeps that canon is the way that he refers to her to try to get Oxley out of his trance is he refers to her as Abner's little girl. And so it's like when he knew Oxley, she was just a child. And so he's trying to, and their mentor's daughter that was a little girl that suddenly he ends up with, and Oxley obviously has a much more healthy relationship with Marion, and that he was a father figure to her as opposed to dating her when she was 15.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
It was disappointing once you figured that out.
yeah.
Their relationship in this movie doesn't get any better than that either, because she's mad at him at first a little bit, but apparently they've just always loved each other, even though he seems to have left her almost immediately after they got together in Raiders, unbeknownst to him with a child. So them getting back together in this movie doesn't feel earned at all.
No, but it's the same. And then but in the Dial of Destiny, they're split again, right? Because he
Well,
But
of
then they
course
get
they
back
are.
together.
went into himself. Yeah. It's just a very toxic relationship.
yeah. and the power imbalance is kind of fairly obvious. And I think so. Yeah. My understanding of the kind of temporal order is that Temple of Doom takes place first, so it's like in 1936 or something, and then Raiders, and then Holy Grail. But in Holy Grail, Marion's not mentioned at all.
No.
So somewhere between Raiders and Grail, she's been dumped, and that's how he gets with.
and Mutt's been born, I'm guessing.
Yeah,
right?
It must be, because if this is set in 57 and he's 18, 19, something like that, 20.
Was the first one set in 36? Or Raiders
something like
was
that.
36?
No, Temple of Doom is in the 30s.
Oh, yeah, I think Temple of Doom's 36.
Yeah, Raiders is set in 1936.
Okay.
And
this one is 57, so Max Mutt could be 21, but probably a couple of years younger.
Yeah, he's just dropped out of prep school, it's implied, right? And that's where he learned defense. Is that what we're supposed to take away from
And
that?
Last Crusade is 1938 is when it's set. So 2 years after Raiders.
Yeah, it's an interesting timeline.
So they really haven't spent very much time together at all. If you were to count up the years that they were together, it's probably like 5 years throughout their whole lives.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that may be part of the problem at the end, is that Indiana Jones has moved to Hunter and is also running a small CRM firm to earn up enough to pay off the old child support payments that he's accumulated. So, I mean, that would be another good one. Would be Indiana Jones and the environmental consulting company.
Indiana Jones and the pipeline project. It's,
Yeah.
Indiana Jones and the CPA.
JonesCon. But yeah, it's unfortunately not a very good movie. That's, I guess.
Yeah.
So what are all of our final thoughts on this movie then?
That was mine. I've got that and the newer twins theory. That's all I got.
I'm in the camp that it's better than I remember it being, but I can't forgive the three scenes that I've identified. The fridge. I guess you guys have convinced me that maybe that's not as bad, but the Tarzan swinging and the flying saucer
that was
are
horrible.
awful, and I really, really don't like the character Mac, and Mutt was also just annoying. I think it fits more. Yeah. I will say I think it fits more with the original trilogy than Dial of Destiny does, having seen both of them in recent memory. But yeah, I'm on the fence. It's neither the fourth or fifth movie hold up to the first three.
Yeah. I feel like, actually, I thought Dial of Destiny was more true to the beginning ones, but I don't know. But just Shia LaBeouf just pissed me off so much in this that I don't think that I ever really gave it that much. Like, everything else about it didn't really bother me because it all kind of fit. Like, when I talked to other people about it, they'd be like, oh, it was just so silly and so corny. Like, that would never happen. I was like, yeah, but Indiana Jones is corny, right? It's just fun corny.
Yeah.
So I didn't mind it all that much. Except for the Shia LaBeouf and the monkey scene, and
except for the second most predominant character, it was fine.
Yeah. I mean, my thoughts are similar. Just that I don't think for me it didn't get any better with the kind of passing of time. It's definitely the worst of the five, I think, by a long shot. And I agree with Kim that I think
it's
Dial of Destiny's a better film. It's not a great film, but it's better than Crystal Skull, and that's how I described it to friends who asked what I thought of Dial of Destiny. Better than Crystal Skull, and that's, you got to take that as a win, I think.
I was really hoping I was going to be able to come into this being contrary and be like, oh no, Crystal Skull is the best one. It's my favorite one. And I can't do that.
I think Ross and I probably would have just quit. We would have been like, that's it. You need to find new hosts.
We'd have done like the Dean and just submitted our resignations.
Actually, I've got a question. Does anyone know anyone who likes Crystal Skull? So a bunch of my students actually just like Dial of Destiny. I think
instant fail.
Yeah. Well, I was on sabbatical, so I with Indiana Jones. I was doing an Indiana Jones, Anyway, but and I was just curious about it because no one's ever told me they like Crystal Skull, but a lot of people have told me they like. No. Not a lot, but a handful of people, probably more than not, have told me they like Dial of Destiny. I don't know if anyone knows anyone who likes Crystal Skull.
Yeah.
No, I don't.
Yeah.
So I think I'm the only one who hasn't seen Dial of Destiny because I was just like, oh yeah, I'll get to it eventually. And then when I finally looked up the showtimes, it's out of theaters already. I'm like, what? Can't be.
Oh, wow.
Time can't
It's
be
been a
moving that
while.
fast.
Yeah.
But I will say that if I'm going to choose an Indiana Jones, there's a pretty good chance, and I might regret it after I make the decision, there's a pretty good chance I choose Crystal Skull just because it hits the stuff I'm interested in. I like that pseudo-archaeology, the aliens and the crystal skulls. That's what I like. So if you gave me the option, like you have to watch one Indiana Jones, you can only choose one, I might choose it, and then at halfway through I might be like, oh yeah, I shouldn't have chosen this one. But I might do it.
Face.
Yeah.
It's
my
controversial,
face.
highly controversial.
We're going to have to get to the other ones because Temple of Doom is the one I've seen the least. I might have only seen it all the way through in one sitting once in my life. But in my memory, that's my least favorite. So I might put Crystal Skull above Temple of Doom. Once we go back and rewatch it, I might change my mind. But this is where I'm sitting with them.
Ross is going to have to go lay down after this.
Yeah.
Having rewatched them all recently, I actually quite enjoyed Temple of Doom again.
Yeah.
Apart from all the screaming at the start, which if you have children, there's just too much screaming. It's like a PTSD thing, harkening back to. But after that, it gets pretty good. So.
The first three are more beautiful movies. I think they just look better.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah. They don't really have all that regular boring Hollywood stuff that the other ones
And it's all
have.
practical. I mean, I think that's also the difference is that, Crystal Skull very much is burdened by the crappy CGI that it has.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that uncanny valley effect and the weird fourth wall, like with the ant goop ending up on the camera screen. I was like, why? It was just an odd decision, that
I think a lot of the reason why people hated the Crystal Skull, like there was so much reaction to that, and then everybody's like, oh, Dial of Destiny was pretty good, it wasn't bad, is because the trilogy, and then you grew up on it, and then you waited so long, and then they made a fourth Indiana, and you're so excited about it. And it was always going to let you down, but it let you down worse than what you expected. And then so I think everybody just went into the Dial of Destiny just a little bit cautiously, right? Like I wasn't expecting much. I kind of expected to hate it.
I would completely agree with that, actually. And I went into it with no expectations, and I was actually pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, same.
Yeah. But I went into the Crystal Skull with huge expectations.
It was like Phantom Menace all over again.
Yeah.
I mean, what's a movie without a 40-minute pod racing scene? Like that's
Yeah. And then that would make Mutt would be that Jar Jar Binks.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was very Jar Jar Binks.
100%.
Yes. Yeah.
So Ken and Gabe, where can our listeners find you?
We do the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast, and that's available anywhere fine podcasts are downloaded.
And we have Instagram, we have a YouTube channel, and do we have any other platforms? I don't think so.
No, I think.
Are you on X?
I am, and occasionally, but not really. It's like I pretty much do just to post the podcast once in a while.
I never have been, and I never will be, which is a real point of pride for me.
Yeah. And we have an email address as well, which is Ken, what is our email address?
New Brunswick Archaeology, all one word, and it's spelled ARCHAEOLOGY, so in the Americanist tradition, at gmail.com, newbrunswickarchaeology@gmail.com. It's an email address that we get people to send emails to, and then I forget to respond to them. So,
but we typically read
So
them
like
on
every
air.
email address then.
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
I have a question for you about your podcast because you've had a contest to win some swag, and has that is that contest still ongoing?
The contest is ongoing. The hiatus that we've been on for the month of August so far has meant that that swag from Ecofor is still available. And the way you would get that is if you go to our Instagram. Or you can email us. There's a bingo card made by one of our listeners. Ken and I, this probably won't shock you, even after only knowing us for about an hour now, hit on some of the same themes over and over again. And the bingo card refers to some of those themes. So if you email us a finished bingo card or tag us with on Instagram with or any other social media you have, really, it's just that's where we're going to see it, with a finished bingo card, you get entered into the drawing and for a bunch of cool swag, like some trowels, backpack, hats.
That's such a good
Cool.
idea.
Yeah, it's a great idea.
Yeah.
Here's my question for you, though. Does it have to be a winning bingo card or just a filled out bingo card?
We've been a little vague on that, but I think we applied a winning. Someone might have snuck in, but we're changing the rules now. It has to be a winning bingo card.
Yeah.
See, that's my problem. I haven't won yet. I've been playing along, but I haven't got a winning card to send in.
We went to go draw it the first time, and Gabe and I didn't talk about this before, and we went to go make the draw and realized we didn't have anybody entered in the contest yet. So we had to change the rules so that we had people enter the contest.
Yeah, we had a whole setup too because the other one each thought the other one must have had a stack of them to draw from.
Yeah.
We do have successful entries now.
Yeah.
Not very many.
And you guys, so you mentioned you've got like around like 50 followers or whatever, right? Like the audience, and I wonder, like, we have about 50 followers, and I wonder if the Venn diagram is just two circles, maybe, of these two archaeology podcasts, you know.
I think that most of our listeners are not archaeologists or paleontologists. I think most of our listeners are people that like movies, because the emails that we've got from people typically say, I don't typically listen to science podcasts or archaeology podcasts, but I'm interested in all these movies. So it's pretty interesting. We don't get a lot of listener email. We don't have great metrics. I don't know how your metrics are, but it's really hard to tell how many people are actually listening in most cases. But my sense is that most of our listeners, I don't know where they find us, but I have a sense that they are listening because they don't already know all this stuff, and they're learning cool stuff about the movies they like, which is exactly why we made this podcast. So that's pretty encouraging for us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've gotten feedback from people that like are non-archaeologists that have enjoyed the podcast and have also pointed out that as non-archaeologists, despite our best efforts to try to, explain to an audience that's not an archaeologist, apparently we get a little bit too much into the inside baseball. So it's
and
something we'll work on in our second season, I guess.
Yeah, and we're going to be doing more interviews and like panel discussions kind of like this too in the next season, because their first season was really trying to just set up kind of the archaeological history of New Brunswick and surrounding areas. So it was much more like Ken and I talking about stuff, and now it'll be us fleshing out that, and everyone has the background, we hope.
But we'll have to get you guys on for like the next movie. We'll have to figure out in the next year or so a movie that we can have invite you guys on to pan something that we can.
They can review the Cree Hunters of Mistassini. That'll be.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Is that a movie?
Yeah, or it's a documentary. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an National Film Board of Canada documentary. It's on the bingo card.
Oh yeah, we've talked about the National Film Board of Canada a few times on this podcast.
Oh, cool. Neat.
Was the Ugly Little Boy, was that from the National Film Board of Canada, or was that something independent?
Possibly,
I don't remember.
Could well be. I don't know.
The Isaac Asimov story about a Neanderthal child that was brought into the future.
Oh, I actually don't know that one.
I don't either.
Mm-hmm, it's very interesting. Something else we talked about National Film Board, though I can't remember what we were talking about.
Neat.
Was it about the house hippo? Was that National Film Board?
The house hippo is these guys are laughing because every Canadian knows the house hippo.
Yeah.
That was Concerned Children's Advertisers or something like that. Is that what it is? A message from Concerned Children's Advertisers?
All it did was break our hearts.
Yeah, one of the joys of my friendship with Gabe is introducing him to Canadiana, that sort of stuff. So when we were doing our episode on the proto-historic, proto-contact period, and early historic period, Gabe had never seen the John Cabot heritage moment. So we watched it while we were recording the Sire Till the End of Time, like the cod one, and so that's.
I know the word. It means nation, and Canada is its name. I can remember word for word those heritage minutes. I think there's a YouTube playlist of all the heritage minutes. We'll put those in the show notes.
Yeah.
Oh, I wouldn't mind seeing those as an adult. Yeah. I smell burnt toast.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ross.
It's okay. No, I feel like I'm missing out on. It sounds like Canadian propaganda is what you're kind of describing to me.
They don't hold up. Put it that way. They have a very focused, a narrow focus on what exactly Canadian heritage is, and lo and behold, it's mostly post-Confederation and a lot of white. So
Mhm.
There's a lot of different kinds of commercial segments for various propaganda that used to play on children's programming. Do you guys
Gotta get 'em
remember
young.
drugs, drugs, drugs?
Some are good, some are bad. Drugs, drugs, drugs. Ask your mom, ask your dad.
I played that drugs, drugs, drugs commercial for a friend of mine from Europe, and she was like, how can they say drugs are good and bad to children? Like, we didn't just have
'Cause
blanket
some are
drugs are
good.
bad education in Canada. Yeah.
Was that the same one with the raccoons trying to eat the mushrooms?
No, but that
No,
was a good one too.
Yeah.
Wasn't that the don't you put it in your mouth? Don't you
Yeah.
put it in your mouth?
Yeah.
Don't you stuff it in your face? Don't you stuff it in your
Though
face?
it might look good to eat. Like
This
a
is
muffin
going
or a treat.
off the
Like a
rails.
muffin
this
or a
episode.
If you don't know just what it is, remember, boys and girls.
Well, everybody except the Canadians have shut off this episode. So for all the Canadian listeners who are still listening, check out the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. Play that bingo card and maybe win some cool archaeology swag. And we'll have you on again for another movie. We'll be on your show if you want us to talk about something. And thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks very much. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for coming. If you've been enjoying Screens of the Stone Age, get in touch with us. Follow us on Twitter at SOTSA_podcast and on Facebook at SOTSA podcast, or send us an email to screensofthestonage@gmail.com. Screens of the Stone Age is supported by the Paleoanthropological Society of Canada. Find out more at pasc-scpa.ca. This is a pretty long recording here.
This is like the shortest episode we've ever had, I think.
Yeah.